All right, welcome to Unit 4. We are going to start our unit on racism in the individual and society, and this is our second to last week of the term, so congratulations on making it this far. So this is like I said, it's going to be our introductory lecture, and we're not going to get into the issues that either Bloom or Shelby discuss. Instead, I want to give you a very, very brief overview of some views one might have on what race is, and then also some of the other questions that one might ask about race and racism, most of which we're not going to talk about in this unit. But to give you a sort of overview picture is my goal in this introductory lecture. And so that you know where we're going, the main question we're ultimately going to focus on is whether we should be thinking about racism as something that is in the individual, or whether we should be thinking of racism as something that is primarily in society and institutions. And if the answer is that we should be doing both, then should we give one primacy over the other? So that's where we're headed. Okay, what is race? So let's talk about a few options that are out there. So these are views that people have held either in history or now. One view is simply that races do not exist at all. So we might talk about race, but we're actually talking about something that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as race. Another view is that races are biological natural kinds, which is to say that there are essential differences between races. A third view is that races are groups of people that are distinguished by some physical traits which indicate differences in geographical ancestry, but these aren't essential differences. And a fourth main category of views says that races do exist, but they're socially constructed. So the first view we're going to call eliminativism or skepticism. Both of these terms are okay. The second view is more often than not called racial naturalism. It's also a kind of essentialist realism, so it says race is real and it's essential. This view is endorsed by nobody that I know of anymore. It was popular at various points in the history of philosophy, but it has been discredited now. The third view is actually endorsed by one of our own faculty in the philosophy department, Michael Hardamom, and he calls this view deflationary realism. And so if you're interested in this view, you might check out his book called Rethinking Race, The Case for Deflationary Realism. You can also check out when he is teaching a course on race next. I know it's not in the fall, but he's taught one in the past year or so, I think, so it should happen again. And then finally, the view that races exist and are socially constructed is called intuitively constructivism. So I've given you these four views. I do want you to know, though, that in fact, people have carved out many more distinctions in views that one could have about race. So I'm not even going to name all these out loud. I just want you to see that there are a lot of different views about what race is. And in part because of this, we cannot gain an entirely complete understanding of or a theory of race in this course. I want you to be aware of the fact that there are a number of different positions out there that people defend. And I want you to have a sense of some of the main options, but we're not going to settle these debates. In the spirit of having a sense of the main options, though, I do want you all to watch a video that I've linked to in the syllabus and on Canvas. And this is a part of a lecture by Charles Mills, who is a philosopher that's done a lot of very influential work on race. And in this video, he gives you a very concise and helpful explanation of what constructivism about race is and some of the implications of a view like that. And because this is also, I think, for many people, a very compelling view and it's very popular, it's important to have a sense of what this position says. So make sure to watch that. So there are a bunch of questions about race one might ask, and unfortunately we can't ask them all, but I want you to be aware of them. So one might want to get clear on the difference between race and ethnicity. There's a good Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on race that has a section on this. If you're interested, I can direct you to that. Um, we mentioned that the essentialist realist view of race as a natural kind was popular at different points in the history of philosophy. And there's a lot of interesting questions about how the concept of race emerged and how philosophers treated that concept at various points in the past. Okay, but after all, we're aiming to talk about racism. So how do we get from the views, questions about what race is to questions about racism? And why should debates about what race is matter for debates about racism at all? And as you might have guessed, we can explain the connection in this way. If we want to get clear on what racism is and what we should do about it, we better make sure that our thinking on those issues don't rest on falsehoods about race. So, to have an extensive debate about what race is, we would need to go to a philosophy of race class. However, we can make some progress in our understanding of racism even without a very clear account of race in itself in hand. So that's what we're going to try to do. We're not going to settle all the questions we might have about race. Um, we're going to acknowledge that ultimately, if you want to have a full account of racism and a good understanding of racism, you need to have a good understanding of race too. But we can't tackle all those questions here. And again, because this class is about the interplay between problems of the individual and collective morality, we're going to look at a set of papers that's going to help us think about just where racism is. So is it in the heads and hearts of individuals? Is it in societies and social institutions? Is it in all of the above? Um, if so, should we start with a theory of individual racism and then move to a theory of racism in society? Or should we start by thinking about racism at the social institutional level and then from there give an account of individual racism? Is there a way we could be doing both at once? These are the kinds of questions we're going to think about. And I just realized I have a typo, so I will fix that before I post. Sorry about that. All right. Let me leave you with a few other moral questions you might have about race and racism so that you know these are questions that have literature on them, even though we're not going to talk about all of them in this course or in this unit. So what is required by racial justice? That's a matter of dispute. How should we even be theorizing about racial justice at all? There's a lot of debate about whether social contract theories are sufficient or insufficient to give us an account of racial justice. How should we address racial inequalities? Should we employ policies of affirmative action? Are people morally responsible for their implicit biases, assuming we have some implicit biases about race? And to link back briefly to last week's unit on voting, should there be race-conscious electoral districting? So there are actually both pro and con arguments for the view that says we should aim in drawing electoral districts to group people along racial lines. One of the pro arguments is that it's in the interest of people to have their racial identities reflected in their representatives because those representatives can then speak to their concerns, and race-conscious districting can facilitate this. There are other con arguments, so against this kind of a policy. Of course, there are a lot of concerns about gerrymandering too, related to this topic. So this is just to say there are all sorts of interesting questions about race and racism in ethics and political philosophy that we can't talk about now, but I want you to know what they are. And oh, I wanted to point out that Shelby's going to say something about how we should be theorizing about racial justice, although we're not going to talk about that a whole lot, but keep that in mind because he does have views on this. Okay, I will see you in lecture 4.2, which is going to be on Bloom's account of racism and racial terms.